So, how many comic books do you read in a month? Well, the average is 12, according to a bunch of retailers who compiled statistics from somewhere. I suppose that number is reasonably accurate. Is that your experience? And if it's 12, then you're basically paying somewhere around $42 a month for comics. Is that right? Let's talk about that. Hey everybody, this is Perch. I've been fascinated by the way people read comics and how they consume the content, how much they can take in a day, in a week, in a month. There's all different styles. There's people who just kind of pour through it. There's some I know many people who will read a comic and never touch it again. They read it once, they read it carefully, they put it in the bag of the board, it goes off into the vault somewhere, and it's just never seen from again. And I know other people have the style of kind of reading quickly and then coming back to it a couple days later and reading it in more depth. It's kind of all different styles, all different speeds in which people read comics. I do know that the more, and maybe this is just kind of practical, the more comics that people try and read in a month, the quicker they read them, the less detail they spend. And over time, the more unhappy they become with comics. What I mean by that is if you're trying to cram in, say, 60 comics a month, then you find yourself kind of racing through them to kind of say you've done it or get through it. And overall, you see a definite correlation between people who just start to enjoy comics much and much less than they used to. They start to basically kind of tune out of the hobby. They're doing it by habit. Now that's interesting because in many cases the comic publishers are pumping out more and more comics a month. You've got Marvel kind of clocking in somewhere in the 60 to 80 range. DC was doing the 52 comics. Now that's somewhere in the 40s. And overall, with that volume of comics, what they want, of course, is your dollar for everything. They would like you to buy more. If you look at an event like War of the Realms, for example, and if you were going to go all in on that event, not do the only read what you like, there's the core series, and you don't have to read the tie ins if you don't want to, which always feels like a bit of a disingenuous statement when it's made by the publishers. They'll say things like that, but they really don't mean it. What they would like for you to do is to buy everything. And then that's not saying they're being shady by wanting that. I mean, of course, it's their business. They want to manage it. But if you think about it, if you think about people on two fronts, how many comics can you reasonably consume in a month that you can reasonably read and still enjoy the hobby? If that number that some retailers are kind of tossing around, 12, is accurate, then that's really not that many. I mean, on average, you're talking three comics a week. Okay. You're still talking, as I mentioned, about $42 or so for those 12 comics, which is almost the equivalent of a game. Is that a good value of your money? Maybe you don't maybe you don't think about it this way, and hey, retailers don't really want you thinking about that way either. But if 12 comics is kind of the average and it's what you can reasonably enjoy and you feel like you have a good experience and everything, then is that better than trying to push your consumers into buying, say, 24 comics a month, double that, and slowly tuning out and becoming disenfranchised with the whole hobby? How long, and unfortunately we don't have stats on this, how long will people read and collect comics before they get tired and they burn out? And do people burn out faster if they read more comics? Well, we do believe that's the case. We do believe that the more comics you read, the more volume, the faster you kind of get tired of it. If you get tired of it, eventually you're only in it for collecting. And if you come to the conclusion that the collecting is not worth your time, then you just burn out completely. I mean, generally speaking, if you're talking about longevity of the business, it's probably better to have somebody who's going to read, be stuck with comics for a lifetime, for a generation. It's better to get a 30-year comic reader than a 5-year comic reader. So it's probably in the publisher's best interest to try and figure out what kind of comics a reader will buy, what is, quote unquote, their comics, market heavily to them, produce comics that will make sure that somebody happily purchases their, 12 a month and call it a day and not try and expand and bloat. And that's my question for you. So first off, we're not getting to it yet, but in the comments below, kind of how many comics do you read a month? How many do you consume? And the other question, and this is kind of the whole second half of this topic, is do comics make even it does it make even any sense to talk about it this way anymore? If comics are read by storyline or by graphic novel or by trade, then you may not be reading 12 comics a month. You may be reading the equivalent of 12 comics a month. You may be reading the equivalent of 30 comics a month if you're going in on 2 to 3 trades. And is that the way you're consuming things? Well, if you dipped over into manga, and this is an interesting, I think, other fact about how readers consume comics these days, is most people who go the way of manga are not reading week to week. They're not reading the newest stuff. They hop over to manga, they start at the beginning of some very long running series, and then they just start reading it. Maybe they go over to My Hero Academia, or they go over to Naruto or One Piece, or one of those kinds of comics, and that's going to keep them busy for years without touching a single piece of quote unquote new content. So they are not your typical comic buyers either. They are people who are going into the backstock, the library of manga, and potentially spending 5 to 10 years just getting through all of that. There's enough content out there you could. But if that works for manga, then the question is, why doesn't that work better for US comics? And I think there's two problems that are happening. One, if you decide, hey, I've got an interest in manga, maybe you watched an anime or something, you got interested in that content, it's very easy to kind of hop over there and say, hey, here's volume one of One Piece. It's in a digestible trade, and you can grab it, and then you can come back for 2, 3, 20, whatever it happens to be. But it's very easy to kind of find your way. With US comics, I think it's a lot trickier. If you're just going to go in and say, "Hey, I want to, I watched the movie. I'm interested in Avengers." What are you starting with? There's not an easy collection. Yes, I know they've done some prints, but there's not an easy collection to kind of hop over there and just say, "I'll buy volume one of the Avengers, and it's $10, and I'll get 10 issues or whatever it happens to be in that volume, and off we go." U.S. comics publishers haven't done it that way. They haven't chosen to produce comics in that kind of format. And why? It seems like that would be a really obvious way to get people involved. Instead, the trade market tends to be for events. It tends to be things like, hop over here and you can get the Infinity Gauntlet, or you can hop over here and you can get, this storyline. But if you're picking up the trade and you're not familiar with comics, you really don't know what you're getting. When because I sometimes wonder if the publishers are aware that people know, but that this Avengers comic you're buying is probably not the beginning. When you pick it up and you read it, it's not like the first page just introduces you to everything nice and clean, like manga does do. Instead, you're hopped into the middle of a Avengers adventure, but that's not really the way people want to consume the comics. They want to consume it, in some kind of order. And they have no qualms about going back to the 60s in terms of content, as long as it's served up nicely to them. But try this for yourself. Go into an Amazon bookstore, or the physical one, or a Barnes and Noble or something. Stand in front of the graphic novel section. Just try and figure out what in the hell is going on. Where do you begin? If you like Spider-Man, where do you start? You just start pulling stuff off the shelves, but where do you even begin? Now, keep in mind, the publishers talk all the time about how continuity is too confusing for readers, and it's a problem. But their solution to it, if anything, has made the problem worse. So I go back to my original question: how many comics can you consume in a month? What do you buy? What are you happy with? If it's 12 new comics, fine, that's one market. But if you are going to leverage kind of the way that manga has worked in the US with US content, you have plenty of content. There are thousands upon hundreds of thousands of comics out there to easily replicate what goes on in Japan and to service this market, and then maybe tip the question in a better direction. Instead of buying 12 comics a month, maybe you're consuming 200 pages. Maybe you're buying kind of one arc, 2 arcs at a time. That can always work. But there is no trade jumping on point. And so if you're buying 12 comics a month, are you hooking long-term readers or not? Anyway, I've got a couple different topics here all going, so I apologize for that. But my question is now to you. What do What do you read? What do you like? How many comics do you buy a month? And do you think about how much you're paying? Does it fluctuate? Do you buy kind of on demand based on what you're into? Or do you pick up a certain set volume of comics? Do you have just your runs? I'd love for you to tell me in the comments below how many comics you're reading a month. And do you think this is a lot, a little? Are you starting to tune out or not? And have you noticed that if you have more comics than you can really, reasonably deal with in a month, does it detract your overall interest in comics as a whole? A lot of questions there. Leave me a comment below. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter or Facebook. Send me an email if you like. Most importantly, thanks for listening.